Welcome to tonight's event. You can all hear me okay? I'm not too shrill and loud. And importantly, did everybody who wants a bar get a bar? We have a whole box right here, and otherwise you can pick one up on your way out. Hello, my name is Dr. Jean Keller. I'm a professor of philosophy and the chair of the Gender Studies Department here at St. Ben's, St. John's, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce tonight's speaker. And I'm introducing our speaker in this lecture tonight on behalf of Dr. Pedro dos Santos from the Political Science Department, who has worked for many months to bring our speaker here to campus, and then he got a conflict scheduled, so he will probably be showing up a little bit later. He's, if you know him, one of those faculty members who's trying to do like 2 or 3 jobs at once. And some weeks that goes more smoothly than others, and this is just a challenging week. So please bear with me, and soon I will turn you over to our speaker. First, I want to thank the Political Science Department for bringing Dr. Juliana Restrepo Sanin to our campus as part of their Global Awareness Lecture Series. Thanks too to the Multicultural Center for this fabulous space and providing the tech support. And I have to say, it's a little weird, but remember these are Pedro's words, thanking the Gender Studies program as well for our help and our support. Dr. Restrepo Sanin's talk is titled Violence, Backlash, and the Persistence of Women's Political Exclusion in Latin America. Dr. Restrepo Sanin received her PhD from Rutgers University, one of the country's most renowned programs for research on women in politics. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and is now an assistant professor of political science at the University of Florida. Dr. Restrepo Sanin has published in prestigious academic journals, including Perspectives on Politics, Comparative Political Studies, the European Journal of Politics and Gender, and Politics and Gender. Her research on violence against women in politics explores the relationship between efforts to improve the quality of democracy and the increasing reports of violence and harassment directed at women in electoral politics. Her current book project analyzes violence and harassment against women politicians in Latin America, the role of women's activism in bringing attention to this problem, and the development and effectiveness of state measures to end it. Dr. Restrepo Sanin is also part of a collaborative research project on human rights in the Americas. This project, undertaken with researchers at the University of Minnesota and Rutgers University Newark, explores the relationship between perceptions of and engagement with the justice system in Colombia and Chile. I'm sorry, I just changed your photo there, so we're kind of moving ahead. So I will hope you will join me in offering Dr. Restrepo Sanin a warm welcome to our campus as she addresses this timely and important topic.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be here to present my research in my current book project on violence against women in politics. And I wanted to begin my talk with the picture of these 3 women. And you probably know Berta Cáceres and Marielle Franco, who were both women activists active in politics. Berta Cáceres was an indigenous lands rights activist in Honduras, and Marielle Franco was a councilwoman in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And she worked to advance the rights of Black, LGBT, and women's movements. And she also was very vocal against police brutality in Brazil. She was killed due to this activism. The picture in the middle, it's not very clear, but it is of an indigenous councilwoman in Bolivia. Her name was Juana Quispe, and she was actually killed because of her political activity. And these cases of violence against women political actors are the most extreme, but they are not uncommon. And this form of violence takes many forms, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So my research that I'm currently working on, like the book that I'm currently working on, basically answers or tries to answer 3 questions. So first is, what is violence against women in politics? We know very little about what this problem is, like what it looks like on the ground. What explains violence against women in politics? Why it happens? And finally, what are the solutions to prevent this form of violence? So I'm going to talk a bit about the three questions, but I want to start with the first one, which is basically definitions. So violence against women in politics refers to behaviors that specifically target women as women, to leave politics by pressuring them to resign, to step down as candidates, or resign once they are elected. And basically this is a form of political violence. It takes part in the process of competition for state power, but it's also a form of gender-based violence. It happens because they are women. And so violence against women in politics, which I use the acronym VAWIP, or VAWIP, basically it sits at the intersection of these two forms of violence. I also want to define or to explain what I mean by violence, because I take a different approach than many people. Many people think of violence as physical violence or sometimes psychological and sexual violence, but I take a broader approach. I use Galton's definition of violence. He basically argues that the violence happens when there are differences between what it is, the potential someone has, the realization, what actually happens, and that potential. So that distance between what is and what could have been is violence. And I also take very seriously the work of activists and scholars who work on gender-based violence, and specifically on violence against women, who think of violence, or this form of violence, as happening on a continuum. It's not just physical violence, but it's also psychological abuse and many other forms of violence. Basically, everyday forms of abuse are connected to more extreme forms of violence, like murder or rape. So violence against women in politics, or this continuum, takes many forms in politics. So we know physical, psychological, and sexual violence, broadly accepted and easy to find a lot of cases or examples. Online violence is also becoming much more common or much more broadly recognized. But in politics, we also have seen three specific types of violence that are not exclusive to politics. This also happens outside of politics, but in politics they take very specific forms. So the first one is economic violence, which is the control of women's access to economic resources. So for example, campaign funds, and as in this picture, the one at the bottom right, it's destruction of campaign materials or the campaign headquarters. The second type is what we call semiotic or semiotic violence. And it basically refers to the way women are represented or portrayed in media, as either traditional media or online, or as in this case, this is a banner that was placed over a bridge in a Mexican city during a gubernatorial campaign. And I'm not going to read the words, but basically implies that women should only be pregnant and silent, so should stay out of politics. One of the women running for governor was a woman, and this was intended to silence her. The last type is what I call judicial harassment, and I found that this is very prevalent in Latin America. I'm going to be talking more in detail about this, but basically it's the use of judicial institutions to harass and undermine women's work. So this continuum, or this data, from the Interparliamentary Union, which is an organization of parliamentarians across the world, they did this research, a survey in 2016 with women parliamentarians in Europe. And they found that more than 80% women parliamentarians, these are women in high office, have faced psychological violence. Over 55% have faced online sexist attacks, so online violence. 46% and some threats of physical violence, and almost 25% have faced sexual violence while in political office or because of their political activity. This graph also tells us that incidents don't happen in isolation. Many women face different forms of violence at the same time. And this is something that I also found in my research in Latin America and in other countries and regions as well. So violence against women in politics is definitely a global phenomenon. We have here some examples from across the world. The first is the woman on the top left is the first black woman member of the British Parliament, and she has talked about the racism and sexism that she has faced. But during the Brexit campaign a few years ago, she was the member of parliament that received the most abuse online. Over 50% of all the abusive attacks against parliamentarians during the Brexit period were directed against her. And this study also found that women of color, not only her, but Asian women, women Muslim women also face significant attacks, much more than their white counterparts and much more than white men. In Kenya, where activists have also talked about violence against women in politics, it is frequent that before the campaign, during elections, violence increases, and women are targets of this form of violence, multiple forms. And in the United States, we have two notable cases. Last year, or the year before, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer there was a group of men who were trying to kidnap her. And in Capitol Hill, a lot of women have talked about the harassment, not only elected women, but also their staff, about the sexual harassment that they face. And also, this has happened at the state and local level. So going to the region I'm studying, Latin America, I'm going to give you a bit of context. So this graph shows us the increase or the proportion of women in national parliaments, and it shows us that the percentage of women in the Senate and in chambers of representatives or chambers of deputies across the region. Basically what we see is that in 1997 the number was really small, barely 10% in the chamber and not even 3% in senates. In 2018, the proportion had increased significantly. 28% of members of Latin American Congress were women, and almost 13% of senators were women. And we know that the Senate is higher, it's harder to get to. The data for today, the current average is 28%, so it has significantly increased from that 10% in 1997, and that's the number we have because there's no data from before, right? So this map shows that several countries in the region have actually reached parity. Mexico leads, and there are other countries, Cuba and Nicaragua, they are not democratic, but it's still significant that they have half of women in their parliaments be women. And many countries have over 30 or even 40% in their national parliaments be women. Of course, there are some countries that are lagging. Brazil is the notable example, and I'm sure Pedro has discussed this a lot because it keeps lagging compared to its neighbors. And Latin America also leads the world in terms of women presidents. These are only the women elected democratically as president. There are many other women who have been vice presidents and they had assumed office, or they were just temporarily presidents. But these are the women, and I'm sure you've heard of them, that have been democratically elected, much more than most regions of the world. You know, maybe Scandinavia is the one region that it's about this. It has about the same numbers as Latin America. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention that these results these numbers are the result of gender quotas and party laws, and basically mandates that parties include women in their electoral list. And basically what has done is increase the number of women. But as the number of women in politics has increased, attacks and violence against them has become much more visible. So this data collected by different institutions in Latin America shows how prevalent this problem is. So in Bolivia, the Association of Women Councilors and Mayors, it's called ACOBOL. This is one of the leading organizations raising awareness about violence against women in politics. They did a study a few years ago, and they found that 48% of women that were leaving office, they had been in office for some time and they were leaving, 48% of them had faced some form of violence while they were in office. In Peru, the electoral authorities, the National Election Juries, the electoral authority in Peru, they did a study a few years ago about women candidates. They surveyed women candidates, and they found that 40% of women candidates have faced violence while in the political campaign. And in Colombia, a study of women who had been elected, and some of them were still in office, some of them had already left, 62% of them had faced some form of violence, either when they were candidates or once they were in office. So this data clearly shows that violence against women in politics is prevalent, right? Even though it also shows some of the challenges of studying this problem. The first one is they are studying different things. We don't really know for sure how they are defining violence, and I mean, well, I can tell you, they understand violence differently. For example, in Peru, they only think about violence during the electoral cycle. They don't think about violence beyond the electoral cycle. When in Bolivia and in Colombia, it's clear that they think of violence mostly while in office, but in Colombia also before. And they are studying women at different levels. So it's really hard to compare this data accurately because of these problems. So part of my research is actually trying to answer this question and provide set of tools that will help us really study this problem and do comparative analysis. So one thing that I found from my research that I think is really important, and it's very specific to Latin America, is that violence against women in politics is very much tied to processes of democratization. And for those of you who don't know, most Latin American countries have a long history of authoritarian governments, and they transitioned in the late 1970s, early 80s, and up until the 1990s. And since then, the problem has not much been having elections, even though in some countries that's clearly a problem, but making sure the quality of democracy is adequate, right? So they have adopted a number of measures to make democracies more representative, more transparent, much more accountable, and closer to the people. So I found that there are three specific types of measures to improve the quality of democracy that have been, that are closely related. I don't think they are the cause of violence against women in politics, but they certainly facilitate some of the attacks. And the first one is gender quotas, and these are efforts to include more women in politics through affirmative action. The second are decentralization efforts, and I think this may sound a bit strange for you, but in Latin America in the 80s, mostly in the 80s, the central government or the federal government was basically controlled all the resources, and local level offices in many countries were not elected, they were appointed. So that started to change, and when that change happened, we started to see an increase in violence against women. And I'm going to talk about this in more detail in a second. And finally, there are institutions to improve transparency and to combat corruption. Of course, fundamental for democracy that resources are spent how representatives are saying they should be spent. So in terms of quotas and party laws, as I was saying, these types of mechanisms guarantee or mandate that political parties must include a certain percentage of women when they have candidates. And most Latin American countries have either proportional representation systems or mixed systems, so they have to include some women in their candidates. So what happened in these cases, especially this is very common in Bolivia, is the notion of the share seat. Basically, male members of the party say that because of parity, that means that women and men have to share that seat, but that seat for which the woman was elected. And of course, this doesn't happen when the councillor is a man. And they pressure them, sometimes they force them to sign promissory notes. So if she doesn't resign, she will be in debt. Sometimes they beat them down, and in some of the most extreme cases, they kidnap them and force them to sign letters of resignation. Another example is that this is very specific to Costa Rica, but I think it's very illustrative. So in Costa Rica, they have not only quotas for Congress and offices with many people, like councils, but also for executive level offices. In Costa Rica, they have the figure of the vice mayor. It's basically vice president, just at the local level. And the vice president is not a very powerful office. They just, basically their main responsibility is to be there if the mayor is not available, if they leave for vacation, if they have to travel, if they died, or if they resign. So what happened is that the electoral authorities in Costa Rica ruled that parties had to include women even for those offices. And what parties are doing is basically they are nominating men as the mayor and women as the vice mayor. And that will be fine. I mean, ideally it wouldn't happen, but there's not much violence there, except that majors have said that, like women vice majors have said, well, I have much more experience, clearly, than this man who was nominated as mayor, but because I am a woman, they say a woman couldn't rule over a man. In other cases, majors have pushed women to take leave of absence, and in that case, the man will leave, like the major will leave, but the woman will be on leave. So the second vice mayor, who's usually a man, will take the seat. And that's done under pressure. The second set of measures are decentralization. And again, these are efforts to take power away from the central government and give it back to local communities, and that includes resources. So when these decentralization efforts occur in the 1980s, mostly in 1990s, that meant the political parties became much more interested in these offices. They didn't usually pay attention to them. But when this happened, of course, they became interested. And they start seriously competing for these offices. And one thing that has happened is that counselors have the responsibility of overseeing the role of the major. So they guarantee, or they must guarantee, that the major is spending responsibly and not stealing the money, basically. So women counselors especially take that very seriously, and they are very emphatic about their role as they call it fiscalizar, that's the word in Spanish. But what I found is that when they start doing that, when they start asking the major for reports or making sure the budget is actually what it is supposed to be, they start being attacked. And this is a testimony of a woman, a major counselor in Bolivia, and she basically was victim of violence, and she said that basically the attacks started when she and another female counselor started asking the major for reports. But it wasn't just that she received threats, but she also became very famous in Latin America because she had to buy a motorcycle to chase down her fellow council members because they wouldn't let her into the meeting. So they will meet outside of the city of the town hall to visit a public work, for example, a dam that was being built or something, and they wouldn't tell her. So she had to run her bike and chase them to make sure that they wouldn't let her out. They locked her out of council sessions, and she also received death threats against her and her son, and she eventually had to send him away to live somewhere else because she was afraid for his life. And electoral authorities eventually helped her, but this is a very typical example of what I found in violence in these cases. And the final one is the use of transparency and accountability institutions to undermine women, and specifically anti-corruption mechanisms. So one thing that I found is the use of false accusations of corruption. So when these institutions were created, they basically had the mandate to investigate accusations of corruption. And what it's happening to many women is that they receive a lot of accusations, unfounded, without evidence, but they have to investigate. So they have to spend time trying to prove that they are innocent. And again, there is no evidence for that. And in the probably the highest profile case, it's the case of former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. As you may or may not know, she was the first woman president of Brazil, and she was impeached. And the reason for her impeachment was supposed to be corruption. But a deeper analysis actually shows that it wasn't really that what's going on. In fact, some people say that she is the cleanest politician in Brazil. She was never found guilty of enriching herself. Like, she is very clearly not guilty of corruption. But a very large proportion of the members of the Senate and Congress that impeached her, that voted for her impeachment, were actually investigated for corruption, and some of them had actually been found guilty of corruption, or vote buying, or even money laundering. And the proportion is really high, like 45 out of 81 senators, and 270 something members of Congress out of 530. So it was a very significant portion of congressmen that were voting for her impeachment. During the impeachment procedures, there was also a lot of sexualized language and images that were circulated about her. And the vice president, who was the person who will actually benefit more because he will have become president, or he became president when she was impeached, he wrote a letter to her in which he told her, "I feel like an ornament, you're not paying attention to what I'm saying." And he was at least partially behind the impeachment procedures. So, yeah, why should we care about this? I mean, I know these are very striking cases and sometimes they're horrible, but why should we care beyond just protecting individual women? So violence against women in politics, of course, has effects on women, on the direct victim and their families. As I mentioned, one of them had to send her son away because of the threats she was receiving. But it also has impacts on the communities that which these women belong to. They lose their representatives, basically, when they are forced to resign, or when they spend time away from their duties. Like, if they have to spend time in court trying to prove they are not corrupt, it's not really a lot for their constituents as well. And finally, it is a threat to democracy, right? Democratic institutions are much more legitimate people, both men and women, perceive them as more legitimate when women are part of the institutions, but also when violence is used to undermine electoral processes, institutions become less legitimate and governments become less legitimate. So let's talk about the second question. What explains violence against women in politics? And some scholars have argued that violence against women in politics is a reaction, a form of backlash to women's inclusion. And the argument basically is that because of gender quotas, we had more women in politics, and that's when backlash happens. And backlash is defined by some scholars as the use of power to regain, coercive power to regain lost power as capacity. So basically the argument under this theory is that because of gender quotas, men lost power and then react violently to regain that power that they lost. And this explanation is quite compelling when you think about Latin America and what's been going on in the last few years. So the region has some countries, this is not a regional trend, but some countries have advanced very progressive legislation on LGBTQ rights and women's rights. And that has created a very violent backlash from certain conservative sectors in different countries. And one example that is very notable is the case of the 2016 peace agreement between the Colombian government and the Revolutionarian forces of Colombia. And basically the peace agreement was very progressive. It included a gender and intersectional perspective because it recognized that the conflict had a specific impact on women, especially on women in rural areas where most of the conflict happened. And these women are overwhelmingly indigenous or Afro-Colombian. So the agreement recognized that and included a lot of provisions to repair the damage done. So opponents to the agreement argue, among other things, it wasn't the only problem that they saw, but this became very much the central point of contention for the agreement. They argued that because of this gender perspective, the agreement will destroy the traditional heterosexual family, and there was nothing in the agreement about that. But that became the rallying cry, and eventually the peace agreement was rejected by Colombians in a referendum. So that makes the backlash argument very compelling. And given this context, we can say, well, yeah, maybe backlash and violence against women in politics are related. And they are, violence against women in politics is a form of backlash. And I think that's partly true, but there are also important differences that make these two distinct problems. And they have different solutions, I guess. So the first one is that backlash is organized and it's a global phenomenon. We've seen the marches in Colombia, but also in Peru, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Spain, in Poland, and here in the United States. And for the most part, these marches and these opponents share a lot of beliefs, and in some cases, they are funded by the same institutions. Violence against women in politics is not organized. It's random, or not random, but different people perpetrating violence against different women. In most cases, it's actually people they know. It's their colleagues, the person who will replace them if they leave, as in the case of Dilma. It's people they know for the most part. Backlash is also against specific progressive politics and rights. Violence against women in politics is not, it happens regardless of the policy position. It happens to conservative women, it happens to liberal women, it happens to women at the center of the political spectrum. And the backlash actors, the people opposing progressive rights, have appropriated the language of human rights. So they argue, for example, in the case of the Colombian peace agreement, that the agreement violated religious freedom and that it also violated the rights of the family. I haven't found any cases of people saying that women's presence violates their rights or that women shouldn't have a right to participate. It's more about how women should participate in politics. And the understanding is that women should be subordinate to men. Violence against women in politics has happened in countries where there are no progressive politics or where there's no backlash movement. Before quotas, I have cases of women who were like the only senator in their country and they were victims of violence. And it also happens in countries with very low levels of women in politics, such as Brazil. And that is important because it means they are not really a threat to men's power in politics. So what explains violence? I think there are a few things that explain violence against women in politics. One is that we usually, and still despite being in 2022, we still tend to think about politics as a man's realm. We think of women's place as the home, and politics as men's realm. And those ideas, even for people who are more progressive or even feminists, are still ingrained in some ways. And that leads us to have very specific associations of what a leader looks like, and women usually don't feel those qualifications. But importantly, I think in Latin America, it is the result of incomplete processes of democratization. So I talked about all of these institutions, and they were mostly focused on politics. But there is not a lot done to democratize society beyond political institutions. And I think part of the explanation is there. So finally, what solutions are there to prevent violence? A lot, which is kind of the happy side of my research, is that women are doing a lot and they have important allies. In most countries, there's some legislation, and this is Latin America. I haven't found a lot of legislation around the world, but in Latin America, there have been some work. In 2012, Bolivia became the first country in the world to approve a law to criminalize violence and harassment against women, and this is a specific law that recognizes this problem. And it was approved because of the murder of Juana Quispe, who was a woman I showed you at the beginning. After Bolivia approved the law, many other countries, and this is the map that shows which countries have different measures. And as you can see, most of the region actually has some form of legislation to address violence against women in politics. Most of the countries have a variety of laws or measures. So some expand their existing legislation on gender-based violence, which in Latin America is quite expansive. And so they basically reform those laws to recognize violence against women in politics. Other countries reform their electoral codes or their party procedures or their party political party laws to recognize violence against women in politics. In some other countries, they have specific laws, like the Bolivian one, criminalizing violence and harassment. And this was possible because of activism, and these are just a few examples. And this is activism both outside of the state, but also women within the state, women politicians, women in electoral institutions, women in courts, basically trying to raise awareness and change how politics is done. So to conclude, just a reminder of the talk, violence against women in politics is a form of gender-based violence, but it's also a form of political violence. It has similarities with backlash, but it's also a specific phenomenon with different origins and with different implications. It undermines democracy, and it's prevented by state, but also by civil society. Thank you very much.
We probably have about 15 minutes for questions, comments, observations, connections to other classes, things you're thinking about.
In your research, have you found many male members of politics that do support legislation and things like that against violence against women?
Yes, not a lot. I think it's still, women know about this problem. Men are hard. I wouldn't say it's because they don't want to. It's sometimes something that doesn't touch them. So, but yes, I have found. In fact, the Bolivian law, they had some male supporters in the pre-sponsoring or when they were working with the law. But eventually, most men in Congress voted in support of the law. So yeah, there are definitely some men allies. Not a lot, but I think it's more because they don't know that this is happening. Thank you. Yes?
Well, this isn't Latin America, but I would just observe right now in the United States, there's lots of threats of violence against election workers, many of whom are women.
Yes.
So could you talk about that? Is that something that you've looked into or that other people you know have looked into?
Yes, definitely, and that's a great question. So when I started studying this problem, I focused only on women who are running for office or who were elected or appointed, because that's where most of the attention was. But as I expanded my research, or as I have dug deeper into this topic, I found that women electoral workers, especially in Mexico, I think it's probably because this is where the problem has been most discussed, but yes, it's definitely a problem, and as you notice, in the United States it's becoming increasingly prevalent, women electoral workers to try to change the result of elections.
Right, and that can have even more direct effects because it can prevent the counting of votes.
Yes, yes, absolutely, and definitely part of that is changing, in Mexico at least, changing the results of the elections. Not even counting, it's just ignore the votes and give us this candidate. So.
I thought it was fascinating just how broad the definition of violence is, that corruption, false charges of corruption, which I wouldn't usually think of as violence, gets included. And I just wondered if you could say something about, why is that violence versus this other related form of discrimination that women experience?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because I don't think I explained it very well. It's not just one accusation, right? It's I have women who had hundreds of accusations, and that is just overwhelming in itself. I interviewed a woman in Colombia who said, well, I will just go to my house and cry the whole night because it was just so overwhelming. And so it's part because of the effects. It's also, remember I started with Galton's definition, so the difference between what could have been and what is. And that really limits their ability to be effective political actors. Like they spend time doing something else. So that is part of the reason I included. Another reason is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not just that. It's also that they are threatened. It's also that they are kept out of meetings. Some of the things that I found is like they give women false information. So the meeting is at 7, and I don't know, the Multicultural Center, but they will tell them that it's at 8 and like church or something. So things like that little by little add a lot. And that is why I included them. And that is definitely one of the things that I found in Latin America, is that they use that, which is kind of a double-edged sword, or it has two dimensions, I think. One is they directly attack women, and they undermine them, and basically people think they are corrupt because someone else accused them. But also it kind of improves the credential of the people accusing them because they are in favor of investigations of against corruption. So it's an interesting weapon that undermines women while places the person accusing them is like the appropriate candidate, for example.
So it becomes kind of a kind of harassment.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
What are the most common ways that you measure violence against women in politics in your own research?
So, because my research, because we don't have a clear definition, and because this problem has different names across countries, I don't do measurements of like quantitative measures. For the most part, my research is qualitative. Yes, so that's the short answer. If you tell me what I think is the most common form of violence based on my research, I will say probably the false accusation of self-corruption. It's very prevalent, and I didn't think it was something that happened across countries, but it's really common. And of course, sexual harassment is also very common. Thank you. Yes.
In your research, was it more prevalent in, like, say, Latin American countries, or like over in Europe? Was there like a specific region that you saw there's more cases of violence against women in politics, more like exploited on like social media and those type of formats?
So my research is mostly in Latin America. Well, it's exclusively in Latin America, but I think we probably have heard more about Latin America because they have been discussing this problem since. Like the first cases came to light in 1999, so for a very long time. In other regions, it's not as old. In the United States, I think the first few cases were during the last presidency. In Europe, with this report that I show you, so it's way more recent. So we don't know a lot. And one of the problems that I found is that a lot of these actions that are violent are normalized. So women think they are okay, and they are not violent. So for a lot of women, even if they are being victims of violence, they just say, well, yeah, that's politics, right? And even if they feel horrible, even if they decide they don't want to run for office again because of all that violence, they just think that that's how politics is. In Latin America, because of the work of these activists that I showed you, this picture, which I think it shows really some of the examples, a lot of women are actually aware of the problem, and because they are aware, they will report, or at least not report it formally, because that has a lot of drawbacks. Like the political parties basically ostracize them, and they lose their political careers, but they will use social media to report the violence.
Excuse me, I'm curious on your opinion of quotas, because it seems like that would be a good way to diversify politics, but then also there's that harm then of backlash. So what's like your opinion based on your research?
I am very much supportive of gender quotas. There's no other measure that has increased the number of women as quotas have. And of course, yes, that's the problem is that people are not willing. And I want to clarify something. Most of the perpetrators are men, but also some women are perpetrators of violence. So it's not exclusively a men's problem. But I think, yeah, the problem is we need to change our attitudes, and it's not just the attitudes of politicians, but also regular citizens into thinking that politics is a place for everyone, right? So quotas are great, and sometimes they have a lot of problems, but I think they can be made better, and it's better to have something that has nothing. And something that is really interesting in Latin America, in Mexico and in Colombia, they have started to move from quotas. Like both countries have parties. Colombia is this close to formally approving party, but electoral institutions have actually started to notch parties to include LGBT candidates. And in Colombia, they also have racial and ethnic quotas. So it's a very great mechanism to push for a more diverse political sphere. Yes?
Do you notice any correlation between violence against women in politics and countries that had more intense or severe dictatorships in Latin America?
Oh, that's actually, I don't study dictatorships because I think it's really hard to get accurate data, and I think that will place women, and honestly myself, at risk if I go there and start asking difficult questions. So I don't study dictatorships, and I noticed that in these countries, they don't talk. Like in most countries in Latin America, there has been some discussion. And in Venezuela, for example, I haven't seen anything discussed. And I think partly it's because women in the communist, in the socialist party can really talk about the party, like against the party. So I think part of that, I'm sure it's happening, but they just can't talk about it. So my guess will be, it will be about the same, but the difference is women in democratic societies can actually talk about it. Or more democratic. So American democracies are not perfect, so. Yes?
Is there a correlation between the level of religiosity among a population and the occurrence of violence against women?
I haven't studied that, but I don't think there will be. Yeah, well, Latin American countries are very religious, so it's. I wouldn't say it's. Like, I wouldn't say there's a correlation, but I can tell you Latin American countries tend to be very religious, and they have high levels of violence against women in politics and outside of politics as well. Yes?
Since people have been collecting data on this in Latin America longer than in other parts of the world, is there enough data to say whether the problem's staying the same over time, getting better, getting worse, or is it just too soon to tell because the measures are still being developed?
Yes, they're really, every country measures it differently. And I hope to be part of contribute to that because it's really hard. Like the data I show you is really, we know about Colombia, but we don't know how that compares to other countries because there's really no single measure. The United Nations is actually trying to do some measurement, but it's really hard. They have a lot of rules about how to measure violence against women, so it's hard. But I think it probably will become more common to see measurements in the upcoming years. Now that in most countries actually, the laws have provision that the state has to start collecting data. So I think we'll start to see some more accurate data.
Any other questions? I just love the broad variety of people asking questions. Just really interesting to see what's standing out. So one last opportunity. All right, well, thank you so much for